The champagne flute shattered against the base of the carved ice sculpture, spraying freezing water and crystal shards across Amara's cream silk maternity gown. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. 400 of Atlanta's elite went dead silent inside the Sterling Estates Grand Ballroom. Outside, the freezing rain of a freak April storm battered the 30-foot conservatory windows, a violent counter-rhythm to the sudden quiet inside the room. Amara did not flinch. She placed one hand flat over her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant. Little Arthur kicked hard against her palm, sensing the sudden spike in his mother's heart rate. Julian Sterling stood on the marble grand staircase. His custom charcoal designer suit hugged his broad shoulders. The dark fabric, a stark contrast to the crisp, white French cuffs resting at his wrists. The heavy gold Novacore pin sat on his left lapel, catching the light of the three-tiered crystal chandelier above. His skin, a flawless deep espresso, usually held a warmth that charmed Wall Street boards and federal regulators alike. Tonight, his jaw locked tight. The vein along his temple rose visible beneath his skin. "I built an empire," Julian's voice echoed through the microphone, his tone dropping the temperature in the room. He descended 2 steps. The crowd parted. Sterling Pharmaceuticals broke $20 billion in valuation this morning. We synthesized the Novacore molecule when Pfizer and Moderna gave up. We bypassed phase 3 clinical trials because the FDA realized what I held in my hands. It was a miracle, the cure for neurodegenerative collapse. I am the architect of the greatest medical breakthrough of this century. He swirled the amber liquid in his rocks glass, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal. And yet, a king cannot rule with a parasite feeding on his throne. He pointed his glass directly at Amara. She stood near the center of the room. Her cream gown fell in smooth waves over her heavy belly, highlighting the life growing inside her. Her rich brown skin glowed under the recessed lighting. She lifted her chin. She did not break eye contact. Her silence was more devastating than any words. A woman stepped out from the shadows of the second-floor landing, descending the stairs to stand at Julian's right hand, Chloe Davenport. The chief legal officer wore a blood-red silk dress with a slit cut high on her thigh. A massive, gaudy diamond and ruby collar sat heavy on her chest, refracting the light in sharp red beams. 6 stacked gold Cartier bangles clattered against her wrist like chains as she handed Julian a thick leather-bound folio. Chloe smiled, her dark lips curled into a sneer. "You see her," Julian said, his voice dripping with practiced theatricality. He walked down the remaining stairs. He paced toward Amara, closing the distance while the guests shrank back against the silk-lined walls. The mayor of Atlanta, a man who had toasted their anniversary last year, now looked at his shoes. The hedge fund managers who had kissed her cheek an hour ago now whispered behind their champagne flutes. The devoted wife, the expecting mother, the woman who smiled for the Forbes covers and wore my diamonds while contributing 0 to my legacy. He threw the leather folio at Amara's feet. The heavy brass clasp struck the marble floor. Pages spilled out across the stone. Legal filings, termination of marital assets, eviction notices. It was fraud. Julian spat the word. He circled her, a shark sizing up a wounded seal in open water. You thought a pregnancy would secure your position. You thought planting a bastard in your womb would give you a permanent seat at my boardroom table. You forged your background. You hid your debts. You lied your way into my bed." Amara kept her hand pressed flat against her child. Arthur rolled again, a heavy, rhythmic pressure beneath her ribs. She breathed in the scent of roasted duck and expensive cedarwood drifting from the catering tables. She looked at Julian's dark eyes. She saw the panic hiding beneath his arrogance. "Look at her!" Julian gestured to the crowd. "She doesn't even have the grace to deny it. She knows the post-nuptial trigger activated at midnight. Every asset reverts to the primary shareholder. She leaves with the clothes she brought in." Chloe laughed. The harsh sound cut through the tense silence. Her heavy gold earrings swung against her neck, flashing under the chandelier. "The rings, Amara," Julian demanded. He stepped into her personal space. "Take them off." Amara held his gaze. She raised her left hand, her fingers steady. She slid the 10-carat emerald-cut diamond past her knuckle. She let it drop. It pinged against the polished stone floor, rolling until it hit the toe of Chloe's red stiletto. Chloe scooped it up, sliding the massive stone onto her own thumb. Julian grabbed Amara's upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, bypassing the thin silk of her sleeve. He yanked her forward. "Security." Julian did not look back at the crowd. "We're taking out the trash." He dragged her toward the grand foyer. Amara's bare feet slipped against the marble, her heels having been discarded hours ago due to the swelling in her ankles. She stumbled, catching her balance only by bracing her free hand against the cold stone of a decorative pillar. She refused to make a sound. She would not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. The heavy mahogany double doors of the estate's main entrance towered at the end of the hall. Marcus Reed stood beside the brass handles. The head of private security wore a fitted black tactical uniform, his imposing 6'4" frame blocking the exit. His face remained a mask of professional indifference. A tiny green light blinked in a steady rhythm on the center of his chest rig. The security body camera was rolling. It always rolled, audio and visual, direct feed to the encrypted estate servers. He did not speak. He watched. Julian pushed Amara hard against the foyer wall. The heavy oak doors sealed them off from the ballroom. The music started again, muffled and distant through the thick wood. Chloe sauntered into the foyer. She leaned against the entry table, her red dress sliding up her thigh to reveal a holster strapped to her leg. She pulled a folded stack of yellowed, handwritten papers from her clutch. The edges were frayed. The ink faded. "It's done," Chloe whispered, her eyes tracking the movement of Julian's chest. "You have your company. I have your name." Julian stared at the yellowed papers. A senile biochemist's original lab notes, Julian muttered, his voice dropping the theatrical boom for a tense, frantic hiss. He reached for the pages. Chloe pulled them back out of his grasp. "If the board knew I didn't write the synthesis, if the FDA knew the clinical trial foundations were copied," Julian's breath hitched. "They won't," Chloe interrupted. She tapped the heavy ruby necklace sitting on her collarbone. "I drafted the patent filings. I hid the discrepancies in the lab dates. I earned this estate, Julian. She just married into it." Chloe stepped closer, waving the yellowed notes in front of his face. "I hold the paper." "You hold the throne," and she goes to the gutter. "As long as the ring is on my finger, no one finds out the great Julian Sterling stole the Novacor formula from a senile old biochemist." Julian's jaw flexed. He looked at Amara. He had no idea. He had no idea the woman standing against the wall was a senile biochemist's flesh and blood. He only knew her as Amara Hayes, the quiet woman he married to soften his corporate image before Chloe showed him the true price of ambition. He did not know he had married the rightful heir to his stolen kingdom. I perfected the formula. Julian stepped closer to Amara, his voice a venomous whisper meant to convince himself. That senile biochemist was a fool rotting in a basement. I took his life's work. I claimed the patent. I built the factories. I made it real. He grabbed Amara's jaw, his thumb pressed into her cheekbone until her teeth ground together. You are collateral damage, sweetheart. A casualty of corporate leverage. I can't afford a messy divorce with Chloe holding a gun to my head. Amara stared into his eyes. She felt the cold sweat on his palm. She felt the frantic, irregular beat of his pulse where his wrist pressed against her neck. She said nothing. Get her out. Julian shoved her away. Marcus reached for the brass handles. He pulled the heavy doors open. The storm rushed in. Freezing rain slammed onto the foyer marble, slicking the floor in seconds. The wind howled through the entrance, knocking a vase of white orchids off the console table. The ceramic shattered. Julian grabbed Amara by the shoulders. He marched her to the threshold. Marcus! Julian yelled over the wind, shielding his face from the driving rain. If she sets foot on my property again, you have authorization to use force. Julian pushed her into the storm. Amara lost her footing on the wet stone step. She fell backward into the dark. Her knees slammed into the rough, freezing asphalt of the driveway. The impact sent a shockwave up her spine. She immediately curled inward, wrapping both arms tight around her belly, shielding her unborn son from the jagged gravel and the ice. The rain soaked through her cream silk gown in seconds. The fabric clung to her skin, heavy and freezing against her shivering shoulders. Julian stood in the doorway. The warm, golden light of the foyer framed him and Chloe in a halo of stolen wealth. The mistress in red stood at his shoulder, a victorious smirk painted on her face as she slipped the stolen diamond ring onto her own finger. Lock the gate. Julian turned his back. The mahogany door slammed shut. The heavy deadbolt echoed through the storm. Amara knelt alone on the wet driveway. The cold washed the warmth from her skin. The wind whipped her heavy, wet hair across her face, blinding her in the dark. She pressed her hands against her swollen stomach. Ah! Arthur kicked back. He was strong. He was alive. She lifted her chin in the dark. The iron gate swung shut. The journey through the storm was brutal. She finally found a cold sanctuary. The fluorescent lights of the Emory University Hospital ground floor restroom flickered in a sporadic, erratic rhythm. A relentless, high-pitched electrical hum vibrated against the painted cinder block walls, drilling into the silence of the empty room. Amara sat on the floor of the handicap stall. The octagonal ceramic tiles offered zero warmth against the bare skin of her legs. Her knees throbbed with a dull, heavy, unrelenting ache. Jagged red abrasions mapped the exact impact of the Sterling Estate driveway, gravel across her kneecaps. Blood mixed with freezing rainwater, trailing down her shins in slow, dark ribbons to pool in the grout lines beneath her feet. The harsh smell of industrial ammonia and cheap institutional pink hand soap burned the back of her throat. She breathed in. The air tasted metallic and stale. Her cream silk maternity gown clung to her skin like a heavy, suffocating layer of frost. The custom Oscar de la Renta fabric, chosen just yesterday for its flawless drape, was ruined. Thick brown mud stained the delicate hem. Freezing water dripped from the embroidered lace collar, sliding down her collarbone to freeze against her chest. Her teeth chattered, her jaw ached from clenching. She pressed both hands flat against her swollen belly. She was 7 months along. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the rushing pulse in her ears, praying for movement. She waited in the harsh, flickering light, counting the seconds, fighting the panic rising in her chest. A heavy, rolling pressure pushed against her lower ribs. Arthur Jr. shifted, a solid, defiant kick against her icy palm. Amara exhaled. The breath rattled in her chest. He survived the fall. He was safe inside her, shielded by the very body Julian had just cast out into the storm. She leaned her head back against the metal partition of the stall door. The cold steel bit into her scalp. Her vision blurred, the harsh overhead LEDs fracturing into blinding, jagged white halos. Buckhead to Emory University Hospital was a 4-mile journey. She had walked the first mile in the dark. The freezing storm lashed her bare shoulders. She hid in the shadows of the massive oak trees lining West Pace's Ferry Road, her bare feet slipping on wet pine needles. Every passing headlight felt like a physical strike. Julian's security teams patrolled those neighborhood streets. If they spotted her, Julian's threat would become reality. A city bus had saved her. The driver, an older black woman with silver braids and tired eyes, had taken one look at Amara's bloodied knees and heavy belly. The air brakes hissed. The hydraulic doors opened in the middle of the block, far from any designated stop. No fare required, no questions asked, just a silent, knowing nod toward the heater blowing dry, hot air near the front seats. Amara forced herself to stand. Her thigh muscles burned, screaming in protest against the freezing dampness. Her right knee buckled. She threw her arm out, grabbing the thick aluminum handicap rail to keep from collapsing back onto the bloody, wet floor. She locked her joints. She pulled herself up. The mirror above the sinks reflected a ghost. Her rich brown skin had turned a sickening, pale ashen hue. Her heavy curls, pinned in a flawless architectural crown just hours ago, now hung in damp, heavy ropes against her cheeks. She stared at her own reflection, struggling to recognize the woman looking back. She pulled a long strip of coarse brown paper towel from the stainless steel dispenser. She ran the paper under the cold water until it soaked through. She lifted her ruined dress. She pressed the wet paper to her right kneecap. Searing heat flared through her nervous system. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to gasp. She wiped the grit away in short, painful strokes. Tiny shards of black driveway asphalt and loose gravel fell into the white porcelain sink, swirling down the drain with the pink-tinted water. She repeated the process on her left knee. Every swipe of the rough paper felt like glass scraping across open nerves. She turned the sink faucet to full blast. Freezing water rushed over the cheap chrome aerator, splashing against the porcelain basin. She cupped her hands, bringing the water to her face, washing away the smeared mascara and the salt of the tears she had refused to shed in front of Julian and Chloe. She dried her face with fresh paper towels. They scratched her skin, leaving red friction marks along her jawline. She limped out of the restroom. The emergency room waiting area was a vast, hollow cavern of molded plastic chairs and muted televisions broadcasting overnight stock tickers in an endless, looping crawl. The air conditioning blew a steady, freezing draft from the ceiling vents, circulating the smell of iodine and wet wool. Amara wrapped her arms tight around her chest. She had no coat, she had no purse, she had no phone. Julian had ensured the post-nuptial trigger severed her from every digital and physical asset before her bare feet even hit the wet asphalt. She sank into a blue plastic chair in the far corner of the room. The plastic creaked under her weight. She watched the triage nurse behind the thick plexiglass window. A young woman in navy blue scrubs typed on a mechanical keyboard. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack echoed through the hollow room, a sharp contrast to the low rumble of the storm outside. Amara pressed her palm to her belly again. The baby's warmth was the only heat left in her world. She sat in the sterile chill, letting her mind travel back to the basement laboratory of her childhood home. The Novacor molecule was not just a pharmaceutical breakthrough, it was her father's apology. A senile biochemist had spent Amara's childhood locked in that subterranean room, surrounded by glass beakers and whiteboards covered in frantic red equations. He missed her birthdays, he missed her piano recitals. He worked through the night, desperate to synthesize the neuroregenerative compound that could have saved her mother from the aggressive early-onset dementia stealing her mind. He failed to save his wife. He succeeded in curing the world. Then came Julian, her father's bright, charismatic, ruthlessly ambitious young protege. Julian Sterling had offered to take the raw lab notes for safekeeping while her father grieved. The patent applications were filed a month later, not under Vance Biotech, under Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Her father had retreated to his quiet sanctuary, a broken, grieving genius outmaneuvered by a corporate shark in a custom suit. Amara had met Julian years later at a charity gala. He had not recognized the brilliant scientist's daughter. She had introduced herself as Amara Hayes, using her mother's maiden name. She wanted to know the man who stole her father's legacy. She wanted to find the weakness in his armor. Instead, she had fallen for the lie. Julian was charming, attentive, and seemingly obsessed with building a future with her. She had buried her famous last name to protect her heart, believing the monster her father described was just a misunderstood visionary. She thought Julian loved the woman. She thought she could redeem the thief. Her heart was dead now. The heavy glass sliding doors of the emergency room entrance hissed open. The wind howled, pushing a spray of freezing rain across the dark rubber entrance mat before the doors clamped shut again. Footsteps echoed against the linoleum. Slow steps, then deliberate, then heavy, leather soles striking the polished floor in a measured, even rhythm. Amara did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the black scuff marks coating the white floor tiles. A man sat down 2 chairs away. He did not speak. He wore a heavy black cashmere overcoat. The wool looked thick, expensive, impenetrable against the brutal April freeze. His dark skin absorbed the harsh hospital lighting. Silver threaded through his close-cropped beard, catching the glare of the muted televisions. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, staring at a faded public health poster on the opposite cinder block wall. Amara shifted her weight. Her wet silk dress rustled against the blue plastic chair. The man reached into his inner breast pocket. He produced a thick, matte black card. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his tailored knees, and placed the card flat on the empty seat between them. Next to the card, he set down a steaming paper cup. The cardboard sleeve bore the minimalist logo of a high-end roaster 3 blocks away. Heat radiated from the plastic lid, fogging the cold air above it. The rich, earthy scent of dark roast Ethiopian blend pushed back the hospital's sterile ammonia odor. He stood up. He adjusted his cuffs. Heavy gold links flashed under the LEDs. The crest of Vance Biotech was engraved into the gold. He turned toward the sliding glass exit doors. He never looked back. The glass parted. The storm swallowed him whole. Amara stared at the empty seat. "Oh!" Her hand trembled as she reached for the cup. The heat seared her numb fingertips. The sharp pain grounded her racing mind. She wrapped both hands around the cardboard, letting the intense warmth bleed into her freezing skin, traveling up her arms, fighting the frost, settling deep in her blood. She closed her eyes, inhaling the steam. She picked up the matte black card. The cardstock was heavy, rigid. It did not bend under the pressure of her thumb. It had no name, no logo, no title, just 10 digits embossed in stark silver foil. An Atlanta area code. She ran her thumb over the raised numbers. She knew that sequence. It was her father's private line, an encrypted relay routed through his estate in Geneva. The ghost network was active. The reality of her situation settled into her bones, heavy and undeniable. The freezing rain outside battered the hospital windows, rattling the glass in its cheap aluminum frames. Julian was back in his dry, heated Buckhead mansion, pouring a glass of aged Macallan Scotch, celebrating his brilliant corporate maneuver. Chloe was parading through the master suite, admiring the stolen emerald-cut diamond weighing down her hand, high on the power of her forged victory. They had stripped Amara of her wedding ring, her dignity, and her home. They expected her to break. They expected her to crawl to a public shelter, shivering in the mud, begging for scraps from the multi-billion-dollar empire she was accused of trying to swindle. She placed her hand over Arthur Jr. He rested quiet now, safe beneath her steady heartbeat. She looked at her bloodied knees. She looked at the mud caked onto her ruined Oscar de la Renta maternity gown. She would not beg, she would not hide, she would not shed a single tear for the man who threw his own unborn son into the ice. She closed her fist around the black card. The sharp corners dug into her soft palm. She welcomed the sting. The silver foil caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like a drawn blade in the sterile hospital corridor. Julian Sterling had just evicted the sole heir to his entire pharmaceutical kingdom. He had locked the gates on the true owner of the Novacor patent. He had handed the keys to a mistress whose only leverage was a stack of raw, undecipherable notes she did not even understand. Amara sat up straight. Her bare feet rested flat on the cold linoleum. She stared at the rain lashing against the glass doors. The empire was already hers. Miles away, the false king celebrated. He retreated to his fortress. The heavy oak double doors of the master study slammed shut, severing the chaotic roar of the storm outside. Inside the sprawling room, the temperature sat at a meticulous 72 degrees. The air smelled of expensive cedar wood, polished leather, and the faint, smoky residue of imported cigars. Julian Sterling stood in the center of the hand-woven Persian rug. He inhaled a slow, deep breath. The heavy silence of the soundproofed walls washed over him. He loosened his charcoal designer silk tie. He pulled the fabric free, letting it slip from his fingers to pool on the surface of a 19th century mahogany desk. He unfastened his crisp white French cuffs. He rolled the dark sleeves up to his elbows, exposing the heavy platinum Rolex gripping his wrist. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth. Long, frantic shadows danced across the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He poured 2 fingers of aged Macallan Scotch into a crystal rocks glass. The amber liquid hit a flawless spherical ice cube with a sharp, echoing crack. "Did you see the mayor's face?" Julian asked. His voice boomed through the quiet room. The man choked on his own champagne. Wall Street titans, federal regulators, men who control the GDP of small nations, and they all shrank back against the silk wallpaper. They watched me butcher my own family tree on the grand staircase, and not a single one stepped forward. Chloe Davenport stood by the fireplace. Her blood-red silk gown caught the light of the flames. The fabric looked like liquid fire sliding over her skin. She traced the rim of an empty crystal tumbler. 6 stacked gold Cartier bangles clattered in a loud, metallic rhythm against her wrist as she moved. The heavy, gaudy diamond and ruby collar sat tight against her collarbone. Sharp red beams refracted across the ceiling. "They fear you. They revere me," Julian corrected her. He paced toward the leather wingback chair nearest the fire. Fear is cheap. Fear requires maintenance. Reverence is permanent. Tonight they witnessed the ruthless, unyielding architect of a $20 billion empire. They saw a man who would cut out his own heart before letting a parasite feed on his legacy. The stock price will surge by Monday. Julian took a slow sip. The aged scotch burned down his throat. He closed his eyes. "She didn't shed a single tear," Chloe sneered. "She just stood there rubbing that massive belly." Julian scoffed. "Amara lacks the spine for theatrics. She expects the world to hand her fairness. She lived in a bubble of quiet luxury, wearing my diamonds, eating my food, thinking that bloated stomach secured her position at my boardroom table." He gestured wide with his rocks glass. The amber liquid swirled dangerously close to the rim. "I built this kingdom from dust. A senile biochemist was a pathetic, grieving old fool rotting in a basement laboratory. I spent months watching him weep over his microscopes. The man synthesized a miracle. He held the cure for neurodegenerative collapse in a plastic beaker, and he wanted to give it away. He wanted to open source the Novacore molecule." Julian laughed. The sound was low, hollow, devoid of any real warmth. "A tragedy, a profound tragedy. I took the burden off his senile shoulders. I took the raw data. I filed the patents. I created sterling pharmaceuticals. I transformed his scribbles into a global monopoly." And what did Amara do? She wandered into my life at a charity gala, batted her eyelashes, and thought she could share my throne. He stared into the fire. "She was a zero-balance asset, just a cheap incubator I rented until I finished building my throne." Chloe set her tumbler down on the marble mantel. The crystal pinged against the stone. "You built the throne. I reinforced the legs." The silence stretched. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked. Julian narrowed his dark eyes. The easy arrogance on his face hardened into a sharp, calculating stare. Chloe crossed the room. Her red stiletto sank deep into the thick wool rug. She stopped inches from his chest. The heavy perfume of her jasmine oil masked the smell of his cedarwood. "I drafted the termination clauses myself, Julian." The moment her bare feet hit the wet gravel outside those gates, the geolocation trackers in the estate security matrix confirmed the physical separation. The post-nuptial trigger activated. Every liquid asset, every property deed, every offshore account instantly transferred to the corporate holding shell. She tapped a long, manicured fingernail against his chest. "And the custody block?" Julian asked. "Filed at midnight. My clerks bypassed the standard 90-day waiting period. Judge Harrison owes me for burying his son's federal indictment last spring. By Monday morning, Amara will face a permanent injunction. She cannot come within 500 feet of Arthur Jr. once he is born. If she approaches the hospital, she will be arrested for trespassing." Julian smiled. "It is flawless." "It is." Chloe stepped back. "Now, we discuss my compensation." Julian's jaw locked. The vein along his temple rose visible beneath his skin. "You have my name. You have my bed. I have your secrets." Chloe held up her right hand. She admired the 10-carat emerald-cut diamond resting heavy on her thumb. "I hold a senile biochemist's original, unredacted lab notes in a secure vault off-site. I filed the fraudulent patent paperwork. I risked my legal license and my freedom to build your $20 billion valuation. I hid the discrepancies in the clinical trial dates. I backdated the LLC formations." She dropped her hand. She stared directly into his eyes. "I want 40% equity in Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I want the Chief Operating Officer title. I want a permanent seat on the executive board. And I want the marriage certificate signed and notarized before the third quarter earnings call." Julian grabbed her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh through the thin red silk. "You overstep, Chloe. I elevate you." She pulled her arm free. The gold Cartier bangles slammed together in a heavy metallic cacophony. "Amara gave you a soft public image. I give you an iron fortress. I hold the power to burn this estate to the ash it came from. Do not mistake me for the fragile little housewife you just shoved out into the freezing rain." Julian studied her face. He looked at the greed dancing in her dark eyes. He saw the exact reflection of his own ruthless ambition. Her phone rested face up on the mahogany desk across the room. It vibrated. A harsh mechanical buzz cut through the tension. The screen illuminated the dark wood. Chloe walked to the desk. The red silk dress trailed behind her like spilled blood. She picked up the device. Her dark eyes scanned the brief, sterile text message displayed on the locked screen. She did not blink. She swiped the notification away in one smooth, practiced motion. She flipped the device face down onto the leather blotter. She turned back to Julian. Her dark lips curled into a slow, victorious smile. She rested both hands flat against her stomach. "You are going to need a new heir." Julian froze. He placed his glass on the side table. "What did you say?" "I am 6 weeks pregnant." Chloe walked back to the mantel. She picked up the crystal tumbler she had abandoned earlier. "We are going to have a child, Julian. A true heir, not some fragile bastard born from a woman who couldn't even defend her own name. A sterling forged in the exact same fire we built this empire with." She reached for the heavy crystal decanter sitting on the silver tray. She poured a generous measure of the aged Macallan scotch into her glass. She raised the scotch to her dark lips. She did not hesitate. She swallowed the amber liquid. She relished the sting as it burned down her throat. Julian stared at her belly. The dark red silk clung tight to her waist. No swelling, no outward sign of the life she claimed to carry. His ego demanded the lie be true. He needed a child born of his own ruthless bloodline. He needed a victory lap. He needed an heir. Julian whispered the word as if it were a prayer. He closed the distance between them. He wrapped his hands around her waist. He pulled her against his chest. We solidify the board. We announce the marriage. We announce the pregnancy. The shareholders will eat it up. A new dynasty. He released her. He walked to the mahogany desk. He picked up the heavy brass receiver of the encrypted landline. He pressed the speed dial button for his lead external counsel. The phone rang twice. Elias. Julian stared at the flickering flames in the hearth. He watched the fire consume the thick oak logs. Execute Phase 4 of the liquidation matrix. I want Amara's personal bank accounts frozen before the sun rises. I want her name scrubbed from the corporate registry. Cancel her health insurance policies. Flag her social security number in the private medical network. If she tries to check into any hospital in the state of Georgia using the Sterling account, I want the claim flagged as fraudulent and denied immediately. He gripped the phone receiver tighter. His knuckles turned ash gray under the strain. She does not exist. He listened to the muffled voice on the other end, confirmed the destruction of his wife's life. Julian placed the receiver back onto the brass cradle. The heavy click echoed through the quiet room. The plan was in motion. The legal machine was primed to crush whatever fight Amara had left. He had severed her financial lifelines. He had weaponized his wealth to ensure she would starve in the cold. He had locked the gate, thrown away the key, and replaced her with a woman who held his stolen secrets. Julian walked to the massive gilded mirror hanging above the fireplace. He adjusted his collar. He straightened his broad shoulders. He admired the flawless cut of his dark suit. He admired the man who had stolen a miracle cure, built a global monopoly, and discarded the useless baggage holding him back. He picked up his rocks glass. He raised the amber liquid toward the dark glass. He had never lost. The long night yielded to morning. The corporate war moved downtown. The panoramic glass walls of the Sterling Pharmaceuticals boardroom offered a sweeping view of the storm breaking over the Atlanta skyline. Rain lashed the reinforced windows. The heavy mahogany table stretched 20 feet across the room. Julian Sterling paced the length of the polished wood. His bespoke charcoal suit held no wrinkles. He adjusted his crisp white French cuffs. He inhaled the sterile, filtered air of the 50th floor. "Liquidate the private portfolios," Julian commanded. Elias Thorne sat at the far end of the vast table. The lead corporate litigator typed on a sleek aluminum laptop. The mechanical keys clacked in a rapid, unforgiving rhythm. "The offshore trusts are sealed," Elias said, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. "The biometric scanners at the Buckhead estate have been wiped. The gates will not open for her. The doors will not unlock. I have flagged her fingerprints in the central security matrix as a hostile intruder threat." Julian poured a shot of espresso from the machine built into the mahogany wall. The bitter scent filled the room. He took a slow sip. He savored the taste of unchecked control. "The vehicles?" Julian asked. "The title to the white luxury SUV has been transferred to the corporate fleet registry," Elias confirmed, tapping a silver stylus against his screen. "Her American Express Centurion card is void. Her private checking accounts show a zero balance. She cannot buy a cup of coffee in this city." Chloe Davenport leaned back in a high-backed leather executive chair. She wore a crimson cashmere sweater dress. A massive golden ruby pendant rested heavy against her chest. 7 thick gold Cartier bangles clattered against her wrist as she reached for a crystal water glass. "Serve the injunction at the hospital," Chloe said. She took a slow sip. Her dark lipstick stained the crystal rim. Judge Harrison signed the emergency order 20 minutes ago. Amara has no legal right to the child once it leaves her body. The moment she goes into labor, Sterling Corporate Security assumes physical custody of the newborn. Julian stopped pacing. He rested his knuckles on the mahogany table. "Send Elise," Julian instructed. "Let her best friend deliver the execution." Julian stepped out of the boardroom. He paused in the silent executive corridor, his gaze drifting toward the frosted glass of her foundation office. He did not enter. He turned away. He followed the mistress instead. The ruthless machine moved swiftly. Dawn brought no relief. The Emory University Hospital waiting room smelled of industrial bleach, wet wool, and old coffee. The digital wall clock flashed 6 o'clock in the morning. The red numbers bled into a harsh, neon glare across the cold linoleum floor. Rain battered the thick exterior windows, blurring the streetlights into smeared yellow streaks. Amara sat alone in a row of molded blue plastic chairs. Her ruined cream silk maternity gown clung to her shivering frame. The thick brown mud from the estate driveway had dried into rigid, heavy crusts along the delicate hem. The cold seeped through the wet fabric, chilling the sweat on her skin. Her bare feet rested flat against the freezing tile. Her bloodied knees throbbed with a dull, unrelenting ache. Jagged red cuts mapped the exact impact of the gravel. Arthur Jr. shifted low in her pelvis. A strong, solid kick pressed against her bladder. She wrapped both arms tight around her belly. She pressed her cold palms against the heavy, solid curve, shielding him from the freezing air conditioning blowing from the rusted ceiling vents. She closed her eyes. She focused on the rhythmic thumping of his tiny heart. He was her anchor. He was the only piece of her life Julian had not stolen. The heavy glass sliding doors hissed open. Dr. Elise Arrington walked into the waiting room. The chief of obstetrics wore a pristine white lab coat over a beige silk blouse. Her silver stethoscope hung draped around her neck. Amara had met Elise on the first day of their freshman year at Spelman College. They had shared cramped dorm rooms, graduation stages, and late-night promises of changing the world. Elise was the godmother. Elise had picked out the exact shade of pale green paint for the nursery in Buckhead. Elise had held Amara's hand during the first ultrasound, pointing out the tiny flickering heartbeat on the black and white screen. Amara exhaled a ragged breath. She tried to stand. Her knee buckled under her weight. Elise did not rush forward. Elise did not reach out to catch her friend. Elise stopped 3 feet away. Her Prada loafers maintained a precise, calculated distance from the mud staining Amara's bare feet. She held a thick, heavy manila envelope pressed tight against her chest. Her knuckles were white. Amara looked at her friend's face. Elise refused to meet her eyes. She stared at the blue plastic chairs. "Elise," Amara whispered. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights grew loud in Amara's ears. "Julian called the hospital board 3 hours ago," Elise said. Her voice sounded flat, mechanical, stripped of 10 years of sisterhood. "He offered a $50 million endowment to fund the new pediatric surgical wing." Amara kept her hands pressed against her swollen stomach. She listened to the words hitting the cold air. "The funding comes with stipulations," Elise continued, her grip tightening on the heavy envelope. "My name goes on the building. My research gets unlimited clinical access. My trial funding is secured for the next decade." Elise finally looked up. Her eyes held a brittle, defensive shame. I cannot associate with anyone engaged in hostile litigation against Sterling Pharmaceuticals. The board made it a condition of my tenure. I cannot be your doctor, Amara. I cannot be your friend. Elise stepped forward. She dropped the manila envelope onto the empty plastic chair beside Amara. The thick stack of legal paper slapped hard against the rigid plastic. "The divorce summons," Elise stated, "and the physical custody injunction." Amara stared at the brown envelope. The rough paper mocked her. The dense stack of legal jargon carried the weight of her execution. The woman she had trusted with her body, her secrets, and her unborn son had sold her out for a brass plaque on a brick wall. "He bought you," Amara said. Her voice held no tears. It carried the chilling calm of a dead ocean. "He bought the future of pediatric medicine," Elise corrected, her jaw tightening. "You were just the price. I am sorry." Elise turned around. The white lab coat flared out behind her. The Prada loafers clicked a rapid retreat across the linoleum, vanishing behind the swinging double doors of the private medical wing. Amara stood alone. The cold bit into her bones. The memory of his voice crawled up her spine, toxic and heavy. The memory surfaced without warning. She was a zero-balance asset, just a cheap incubator I rented until I finished building my throne. The main emergency room entrance door slid open. The brutal wind howled, pushing a spray of morning rain into the lobby. Julian walked through the storm. Ma. His charcoal suit absorbed the harsh hospital lighting. He bypassed the triage desk, ignoring the protest of the night nurse. He marched directly toward the blue plastic chairs. Chloe sauntered in right behind him. The mistress wore a heavy crimson trench coat belted tight at her narrow waist. Thick, ruby hoops swung from her ears, catching the overhead glare and casting faint red shadows on her cheekbones. She adjusted the stolen 10-carat emerald-cut diamond, resting heavy on her thumb. She looked down at Amara. She smiled at the sight of the mud-caked, shivering woman she had dethroned. Marcus Reed stood 3 paces behind them both. The imposing head of private security wore his fitted black tactical uniform. His heavy boots made no sound on the tile. The tiny green light on his security body camera pulsed in a steady, rhythmic blink. He did not speak. He recorded the destruction. Julian stopped inches from Amara's bare feet. He looked down at her damp, ruined cream silk dress. His gaze swept over the jagged cuts on her knees. He looked at the heavy manila envelope resting on the empty chair. A cruel, satisfied smirk broke across his face. "You thought you had allies," Julian sneered, his voice echoing in the vast, empty lobby. "You thought the relationships you built with my money belonged to you. You thought your little college friendships could withstand the gravity of my wealth." Amara did not flinch. She placed one hand flat over her belly. She lifted her chin. She stared directly into the dark, hollow eyes of the man she had once agreed to marry. "I control the ground you walk on," Julian said. He leaned in closer. The bitter scent of espresso and expensive cedarwood washed over her face. "I control the doctors who treat you. I control the banks that feed you." I snapped my fingers, and the world forgot your name. He gestured toward the rain lashing the glass doors. "Walk out into the street. Beg for coins. Sleep in the mud, because that is the only place left for you." Julian lowered his voice to a venomous whisper. "You have nothing. You are nothing." Amara held his gaze. She refused to scream. No begging escaped her lips. She stood in the freezing, sterile corridor with mud drying on her shins and the weight of her unborn son pulling at her spine. She let the silence stretch. Her refusal to break became a physical wall between them. The quiet was a weapon. It dug under his skin. It defied his vast power. Julian's jaw locked. The vein along his temple rose, visible beneath his skin. He expected her to collapse. He needed her to shatter. Her quiet dignity infuriated him. "Let her rot," Chloe laughed, pulling at Julian's sleeve. Her gold bangles crashed together. "She is taking up space in a building we own." Julian turned his back. He marched toward the exit. Chloe followed, the crimson coat trailing behind her like a fresh wound. Marcus backed away, his silent camera capturing Amara's unyielding posture before he turned to follow his employer out into the rain. The glass doors closed. Amara remained standing. The hospital lobby fell silent. The harsh neon numbers on the wall clock ticked forward. She slowly sank back down into the blue plastic chair. She ignored the heavy manila envelope of divorce papers sitting next to her hip. She reached into the damp pocket of her ruined cream gown. The mysterious man from the waiting room had left more than just a business card. He had left a heavy, encrypted, black smartphone hidden inside her pocket. She pulled the device out into the light. The screen illuminated her face. She tapped the silver numbers embossed on the black card into the keypad. The encrypted line began to ring. Amara held the heavy black smartphone to her ear. The encrypted line clicked once, then a second click. A sharp, tearing agony ripped through her lower abdomen. The phone slipped from her slick fingers. It clattered against the cold linoleum of the Emory University Hospital waiting room. She doubled over, her hands clawed at her swollen belly. The brutal impact on the Sterling estate gravel had started a biological clock she could no longer stop. A hot, wet rush soaked through the remaining dry fabric of her ruined cream silk gown. Blood and amniotic fluid pooled around her bare feet, staining the white tiles a dark crimson. She gasped. The air vanished from the room. She sank to her knees. The jagged cuts from the driveway screamed in protest. She pressed her forehead against the edge of the blue plastic chair. The plastic felt like ice against her feverish skin. The harsh neon lights above flickered. They cast long, erratic shadows across the empty lobby. She tried to breathe through her nose. The sharp scent of industrial bleach burned her lungs. Another contraction hit. This one did not build. It struck like a hammer against her spine. She curled inward. She wrapped both arms tight around her stomach. She tried to shield Arthur Jr. from the crushing pressure of her own failing body. He kicked frantically, a rapid, panicked flutter against her ribs. He was drowning. The sudden trauma of the fall had ruptured his sanctuary 2 months too early. She needed help. She could not speak, her throat locked around a silent, suffocating scream. Footsteps rushed across the lobby. Not the heavy Prada loafers of Elise Arrington. Soft, white, rubber-soled nursing shoes squeaked against the wet linoleum. A woman in dark green scrubs slid onto the floor beside Amara. Her name tag read, Helena. No last name. A small, discreet silver pin of the Vance Biotech crest rested on her collar. It caught the flickering overhead light. Helena did not ask for an insurance card. She did not ask for a name. She did not mention the denied coverage flagged in the Central Medical Database just minutes prior. She pressed a warm, sterile towel against Amara's trembling legs. Helena hoisted Amara onto a transport gurney with practiced, quiet strength. The wheels spun frantic and loud against the linoleum. The sterile hospital corridor blurred into a smear of harsh white overhead lights. Amara gripped the metal bed rails. Her knuckles turned translucent. The cold metal bit into her palms. Another contraction clamped around her spine, a merciless, crushing vice that stole her vision. The monitor alarms attached to the gurney shrieked a high, panicked rhythm. Arthur Jr.'s heart rate was dropping. The numbers on the digital display flashed a warning red. Doors slammed open. The freezing, metallic air of surgical bay. 4 rushed over her skin. They transferred her to the operating table. The surface was rigid. It was unforgiving. It was covered in a thin, sterile sheet that offered zero warmth. Surgical lights flared to life. Blinding white halos erased the ceiling. Helena stood by her head. Her dark green scrubs became a grounding anchor in the chaotic blur of blue surgical gowns. They strapped her arms to the padded crossboards. "Ay!" The anesthesiologist pushed a thick needle into her IV port. Ice flooded her veins. It traveled up her arm. It settled deep in her chest. The world spun into a chaotic, muted haze. The frantic shouting of the surgical team faded into a dull, underwater hum. The sharp smell of cauterized flesh hit the back of her throat. She felt the heavy, terrifying pressure of the scalpel slicing through the thick layers of her abdomen. No pain, just a sickening, aggressive tugging. Her body rocked on the table with the force of their movements. She felt cold air hit her internal organs. She stared at the brushed, steel reflection of the surgical lamp above her. She watched the distorted shapes of the doctors moving over her open body. She waited. She stopped breathing. There was silence. Then a terrible, hanging silence stretched across the operating room. The monitor flatlined its awful, steady beep. Nobody moved. Then came the cry. It started as a wet sputter. It escalated into a fierce, raw wail that cut through the sterile hum of the medical machinery. Amara turned her head. Helena stepped into her line of sight. The nurse held a 3-pound, 4-ounce newborn. He was covered in white vernix and dark blood, his fragile skin a translucent, bruised purple. The scent of copper, surgical iodine, and warm milk filled the frigid air. The pediatric team rushed forward. They brought a heated plastic incubator. They prepared the oxygen tubes. Helena blocked their path. The silent nurse raised one hand, halting the rushing doctors. She looked down at the screaming newborn. She assessed his color. She measured his breathing. She wrapped him in a coarse, heated cotton blanket. She bypassed the pediatric team waiting with the plastic box. She lowered the tiny bundle directly to Amara's chest. The heat of his small body seeped through the thin hospital gown, anchoring Amara to the earth. His tiny fists flailed, striking her collarbone. He tasted the cold air and screamed again, a fierce, demanding sound. He was alive. The recovery room smelled of bleached sheets and rubbing alcohol. The digital clock on the wall read 14 minutes past 3 in the morning. The heart monitor beeped a slow, steady reassurance. The storm outside had worsened. Heavy rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the 4th-floor window. The wind howled a low, mournful note through the aluminum window frames. Amara lay flat on the rigid mattress. The epidural medication faded from her bloodstream. The numbness receded. A fierce, burning ache radiated along her incision line with every breath she took. The fresh staples pulling her skin together felt like a line of fire drawn across her lower stomach. She ignored the fire in her nerves. She held Arthur Jr. against her bare skin. His tiny, rhythmic breaths puffed warm air against her collarbone. She studied his face in the dim amber light of the bedside lamp. He had her father's strong jawline. He had her rich brown skin. He possessed none of Julian's hollow arrogance. He belonged to no one else. She traced the delicate shell of his ear with her thumb. The room was empty. The crushing weight of her isolation pressed down on her chest. Julian had stripped her of her wedding ring. He had locked the gates to her home. He had frozen her bank accounts and bought the loyalty of her closest friend. She had no coat to wear into the storm. She had a premature son and a body stitched back together with sterile thread. Julian stood outside her hospital room door in the quiet of the night. He looked through the small glass window and saw her holding the newborn alone. He did not turn the handle. He walked away when Chloe called his name from the corridor. The heavy wooden door swung wide. Chloe Davenport marched into the dim recovery room. The mistress wore a tailored, double-breasted scarlet blazer. The vibrant, blood-red fabric screamed against the soft, muted blues and grays of the maternity ward. Heavy gold Cartier bangles clashed in a rapid, metallic staccato as she crossed the threshold. A suffocating cloud of heavy jasmine perfume rolled into the room, choking the fragile, clean scent of the newborn. A tragic little picture. Chloe stopped at the foot of the bed. She projected her words like a stage actor playing to the back row of a theater. She placed her hands on her hips. Her red stiletto heels sank into the thin hospital rug. Amara did not look up. She kept her hand cupped over Arthur Jr.'s fragile head. Her silence was a fortress. It offered Chloe nothing to strike against. Amara's chin remained up. Her gaze remained fixed on the steady rise and fall of her son's chest. Chloe paced the length of the small room. She surveyed the sterile environment with blatant disgust. She ran a manicured finger over the edge of the plastic bassinet, her long red nail scratching the clear acrylic. She tossed a thick stack of stapled papers onto the rolling meal tray. The documents slid across the plastic. They knocked a plastic water pitcher into the stainless steel sink. The water splashed over the rim. It soaked the sterile bandages resting on the counter. "Julian isn't coming in," Chloe smirked, her dark lipstick stretched tight over her teeth. "He has no interest in viewing the remains of his mistake." Chloe adjusted the heavy diamond and ruby collar resting on her chest. She made sure the stolen emerald-cut diamond on her thumb caught the dim light. "The injunction is active. Security is waiting in the lobby. The second you are discharged, you walk out alone. The child goes to the state until the corporate surrogacy clauses are validated." Amara remained silent. She ran her index finger down her son's spine. The slow, deliberate motion settled his breathing. He shifted against her breast. He sought warmth. "Did you hear me?" Chloe stepped closer. Her red stilettos scraped against the linoleum. Her voice rose in pitch. She craved a reaction. She needed Amara to beg, "You have no rights. You have no baby. You have a zero balance. You forged your way into his bed. Now you leave with nothing." Helena stepped out from the shadows of the bathroom doorway. The nurse moved with startling speed. She bypassed the foot of the bed. She placed her body directly between Chloe's scarlet blazer and the hospital bed. Helena did not shout. She pointed a single, steady finger toward the hallway. "This is a sterile recovery zone. You are a biological hazard. Leave." Chloe laughed. The harsh sound rattled the plastic blinds covering the window. She crossed her arms, the gold bangles slamming together. "Do you know who signed your paycheck, nurse? My fiancé just endowed this entire wing. I can have you stripped of your medical license before the sun comes up. The Emory University Hospital Board signs my paycheck." Helena held her ground. She tapped the small silver Vance Biotech crest on her collar. The subtle emblem flashed in the low light. "You are trespassing on a private medical floor. Security has already been dispatched to remove a woman in a red coat disturbing patient recovery." Chloe glared. The confident sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. She looked past the nurse, aiming her venom at the bed. Amara still refused to grant her eye contact. She did not flinch. She did not argue. The sheer, devastating dismissal burned hotter than any scream. Amara's silence reduced Chloe to a loud, gaudy nuisance intruding on sacred ground. Chloe spun on her heel. The scarlet blazer flared out. She marched out the door, the gold bangles rattling a chaotic retreat down the corridor. The door clicked shut. The heavy latch sealed the room in quiet isolation. The oppressive scent of jasmine perfume lingered in the air for a long moment before the hospital ventilation system pulling it away. Helena walked to the rolling tray. She picked up the stapled injunction papers. Her expression remained blank. She dropped the heavy legal threat into the biohazard trash bin without a single word. The papers landed on top of bloodied gauze. Helena checked the IV drip attached to Amara's wrist. She adjusted the flow of the saline. She checked the swaddle around Arthur Jr. She offered a single, knowing nod, then slipped out into the hallway. She left Amara to her peace. Amara lay in the dim light. He listened to the rain lashing against the window pane. The storm outside raged on. It washed the streets of Atlanta in freezing water. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Arthur Jr.'s heart against her own. She was stripped of her name. She was stripped of her home. She was stripped of her wealth. Julian believed he had buried her. Chloe believed she had stolen the crown. They had no idea whose daughter they had just declared war against. She stared at the ceiling. The door handle turned again. The handle stopped turning. The unseen visitor walked away. She remained alone. The storm outside Emory University Hospital refused to die. Slabs of freezing April rain hurled against the reinforced fourth-floor window. The heavy droplets hit the thick glass like fistfuls of loose gravel, a brutal, erratic rhythm masking the steady hum of the medical machinery. Lightning flashed, casting a harsh, momentary glare across the sterile room. The sudden illumination revealed the pale green cinder-block walls, the heavy steel door, and the rolling metal tray stationed beside the bed. Inside room 412, the air sat stale and cold. It smelled of industrial floor wax, bleached linen, and the sharp, metallic tang of dried blood. Amara lay flat on the rigid recovery bed. The epidural block had worn off an hour ago. Every shallow breath she pulled into her lungs dragged a serrated blade across the fresh incision in her lower abdomen. The row of stainless steel staples holding her flesh together burned with a relentless, white-hot agony. She ignored the fire. She refused to press the blue plastic call button dangling from the metal bedrail. She required no pity from the hospital staff. She required a strategy. The harsh neon numbers on the digital wall clock clicked forward. 12 minutes past 4 in the morning. The Emory University Hospital maternity ward remained silent, save for the muffled squeak of rubber soles passing the nurses' station down the hall. Amara stared at the heavy wooden door. She expected security to breach the threshold at any moment. Chloe Davenport had made the threat clear. The legal injunction was active. Julian's lawyers were circling the building, waiting for the morning shift change to tear her child from her arms. She kept her right hand cupped tight over Arthur Jr. The premature newborn rested against the bare skin of her chest. He weighed barely more than 3 pounds. His tiny, bird-like ribs rose and fell in rapid, frantic staccato beats. His skin stretched tight over his fragile bones, a translucent, bruised plum color that revealed the faint blue map of his veins beneath the surface. He smelled of surgical iodine, coarse hospital cotton, and raw, brand-new life. Arthur Jr. opened his eyes. The newborn stared up at the ceiling. His irises were a cloudy, unfocused midnight black. He lacked the strength to cry. He lacked the body fat to regulate his own core temperature. He depended on the heat radiating from Amara's bare chest to survive the freezing draft blowing from the hospital vents. His head, covered in a fine layer of dark, damp hair, rested small enough to fit within the palm of her hand. She traced the delicate curve of his spine with her thumb. The repetitive motion grounded her racing mind. It pushed back the crushing panic. Julian had discarded them both into the mud. Julian had locked the massive iron gates of the Buckhead estate. He had severed her bank accounts. He had legally isolated her from every resource in the city of Atlanta. He wanted her starving. He wanted her begging on the wet asphalt. He wanted the state to seize her son the moment she was wheeled out of the recovery ward. Amara shifted her weight. The thin paper sheet crinkled beneath her hips. A fresh spike of pain shot up her spine. She reached toward the rolling plastic meal tray stationed beside her bed. The heavy, matte black smartphone sat next to a sealed plastic cup of ice water. The mysterious man in the cashmere coat had slipped the device into the pocket of her ruined cream silk gown in the emergency room lobby. It felt like a lifetime ago. The mud from the driveway still coated her discarded dress, now stuffed into a clear plastic biohazard bag in the corner of the room. She picked the phone up. The titanium chassis felt colder than the rain outside. It lacked the smooth glass edges of a commercial device. It felt like a weapon, a tactical instrument built for a man who trusted no one and monitored everything. The cold metal bit into her warm palm. It carried an imposing, undeniable weight. She pressed the side button. The screen flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue light across the dark room. The sudden glare illuminated the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the dark circles painted beneath her exhausted eyes. The home screen held no applications, no clock, no cellular carrier logo. It displayed nothing but a stark white numeric keypad and a blinking green cursor. She stared at the blank dialer. Beside the phone lay the thick, matte black card. The 10 digits embossed in silver foil caught the blue light of the screen. She knew the sequence by heart. She had memorized those numbers long before she ever heard the name Julian Sterling. It was an encrypted satellite relay, a ghost line. It routed directly to a fortified subterranean estate on the outskirts of Geneva. The only number that bypassed the massive firewall surrounding Vance Biotech's founder. 4 years. Exactly 4 years had passed since she last spoke to the man waiting at the end of that signal. She had walked away on a rain-slicked Tuesday morning in Switzerland, carrying nothing but a single leather duffel bag and a forged birth certificate. She had stood in the cobblestone courtyard, looking back at the towering stone walls of the estate only once. Her father had stood in the massive arched window of his laboratory. He did not wave. He did not come down to stop her. He had watched his only daughter carry his heart out into the world, flanked by a dozen armed security contractors. She traded her brilliant, obsessive father for a corporate shark disguised as a visionary. She remembered the night Julian proposed. He had rented the entire botanical garden, filling the glass conservatory with 10,000 white orchids just for her. He had slipped the 10-carat emerald-cut diamond onto her finger, swearing a solemn oath to protect her forever. It was a calculated performance. She was the perfect cover. A woman with no past, no demanding family, and a quiet grace that shielded his aggressive, predatory acquisitions from public scrutiny. She traded the suffocating weight of the Vance legacy for the warm, charismatic lies. Julian spun over candlelit dinners. She wanted love. She wanted a normal existence. She buried her birthright, hiding behind her mother's maiden name, desperate to build a quiet home based on mutual respect rather than intellectual property. She was wrong. Julian did not want a partner. He wanted a prop. He wanted a quiet, unassuming woman to soften his ruthless corporate image while he scaled the ranks of Wall Street. He paraded her at charity galas. He bought her diamonds to catch the camera flashes. He used her gentle demeanor to mask his own predatory instincts from the federal regulators. She looked at her bare left hand. The pale indentation on her ring finger remained visible in the dim light, the physical ghost of a fraudulent marriage. Chloe wore that diamond now. The chief legal officer paraded through the Buckhead estate, wearing the stolen ring, holding the stolen patent, and believing she had conquered the world. Amara closed her eyes. The harsh hospital lighting faded behind her eyelids. The scent of Julian's expensive cedarwood cologne crawled up her throat, phantom and toxic. Her eyes snapped open. She lifted her chin. The lingering hesitation drained from her blood, replaced by a freezing, calculated resolve. She pressed her thumb against the cold glass screen. She typed the first 3 digits. The screen flashed a silent green confirmation. She typed the next 3. Her thumb hovered over the final 4 numbers. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Arthur Jr.'s heart against her breastbone. He stirred in his sleep, a tiny, high-pitched whimper escaping his dark lips. His fragile hand reached up. His minuscule fingers wrapped tight around the sterile hospital gown covering her shoulder. He needed a protector. He needed an army. Amara pressed the final 4 digits. She hit the call icon. She lifted the heavy titanium device to her right ear. The line clicked. A sharp, digital chirp signaled the military-grade encryption key locking into place. Static hissed through the speaker, a hollow, distant ocean of white noise traveling across a network no government could trace. The static vanished. Heavy, measured breathing filled the earpiece. The sound carried the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who controlled empires. The air in the hospital room suddenly felt thinner. The sheer gravity of the presence on the other end of the line commanded the space, pushing back the smell of bleach and the chill of the storm. Amara swallowed the dry ache in her throat. "Dad," the word hung in the air. "It's me," her voice cracked. She did not cry. She stated the fact into the dark. "I need you." The silence on the other end expanded. It stretched across the Atlantic Ocean. It filled the quiet recovery room. It carried the weight of 4 years of missed birthdays, unanswered letters, and unspoken grief. It held the silent accusation of her abandonment and the devastating reality of her return. A deep, resonant exhale vibrated against her ear. "I never stopped watching over you." The voice was a fortress. It was heavy iron and stone. The connection severed. The screen faded to black. Amara lowered the phone. She placed the cold metal back onto the rolling plastic tray. The blue light died, returning the room to the soft, dim amber glow of the bedside lamp. The storm outside seemed to mute itself. The brutal wind no longer sounded like a threat. Amara looked down at her chest. Arthur Jr. settled low against her skin. His breathing smoothed into a steady, unbroken rhythm. He was safe. She rested her chin against the top of his tiny head. She inhaled the scent of warm milk and life. The crushing, suffocating isolation that had gripped her throat since she hit the freezing gravel of the Sterling estate dissolved. It washed away into the dark corners of the room. Julian believed he had evicted a nobody. Chloe believed she had stolen the keys to an unguarded kingdom. They had no idea they had just provoked the architect of their entire existence. Amara's lips parted. The corners of her mouth twitched. They rose in the dim light. She smiled. It was a small, dangerous curve. It held no joy. It held a dark, terrifying promise. The silence of the hospital floor shattered. Heavy footsteps echoed down the linoleum corridor outside her room. They moved with rapid, purposeful aggression. The hard soles squeaked against the freshly waxed tile. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of room 412. The door handle turned. The heavy wooden door swung inward. It did not creak. The brass hinges yielded to a calculated, unstoppable force. Dr. Arthur Vance crossed the threshold into room 412. He did not resemble the broken, grieving scientist Julian had dismissed as a basement-dwelling fool. He stood 6'2", his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. He wore a midnight blue Brioni suit, the wool cut with surgical precision over his muscular frame. A thick silver Patek Philippe rested against his left wrist. His dark skin carried the rugged, weathered texture of a man who commanded global boardrooms and bent federal regulators to his will, silver threaded through his immaculate, close-cropped beard. He held a black ebony cane with a solid platinum handle. He did not lean on it for support. He carried it like a scepter. Behind him, the sterile hospital corridor transformed into a fortified war room. 12 individuals filed into the cramped space. 7 elite corporate litigators in slate gray suits carried reinforced aluminum briefcases. They moved with terrifying, synchronized efficiency. 5 men wore dark navy windbreakers over black tactical vests. Bright yellow block letters stretched across their broad backs. U.S. Marshal. Their heavy boots thudded against the linoleum, a rhythmic drumbeat of impending ruin. Outside the rain-streaked fourth-floor window, the street below reflected the sudden, overwhelming occupation. 4 black Maybachs sat idling in a diagonal blockade across the ambulance loading bay. Heavy rain pounded their armored roofs. Red and blue emergency lights spun in frantic circles, reflecting off the black-tinted glass. A dozen local police cruisers barricaded the intersection. No hospital administrator dared ask them to move. No security guard dared question their presence. Vance bypassed the armed men. He walked to the edge of the rigid recovery bed. He looked down at Amara. He noted the dark, hollow exhaustion bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. He saw the ruined cream silk gown, caked in driveway mud, shoved into a clear plastic biohazard bag in the corner of the room. He smelled the sharp, metallic tang of her fresh surgical staples mixing with the bitter scent of hospital iodine and bleached linen. He offered no dramatic gasp of pity. He shed no tears. He understood the exact price of survival. He reached out. His large, calloused hand rested against her icy cheek. Amara leaned into his palm. A single, jagged breath rattled in her chest. She closed her eyes. She absorbed the immense, grounding heat of her father's touch. The freezing isolation of the past 8 hours melted away under his grip. 4 years of silence dissolved in a single, unbroken look. Two brilliant minds understood the gravity of the moment without wasting a single syllable of regret. Vance shifted his gaze downward. Arthur Jr. slept against Amara's bare skin. The premature newborn looked impossibly fragile. His bruised plum skin rose and fell with rapid, frantic breaths. The fine, dark hair on his tiny head remained damp from the brutal, rushed delivery. His minuscule fingers curled into a tight, defensive fist against his mother's collarbone. The scent of coarse hospital cotton and raw, brand-new life drifted upward, cutting through the ozone smell of the storm. Vance studied the boy. He recognized his own strong jawline. He recognized the exact shape of his late wife's brow. He survived the fall. Amara traced her son's spine. He has your mother's iron. Vance kept his eyes on the child. His jaw locked. A dangerous, glacial stillness settled over his weathered features. The platinum handle of his cane bit deep into his palm. He looked at the abrasions on Amara's knees. He calculated the exact force required to push a pregnant woman onto freezing asphalt. He turned his back to the bed. He faced the room. He raised 2 fingers. The aluminum briefcases snapped open. Heavy laptops booted. The sterile hospital room became a subterranean command center. Execute the liquidation matrix. Vance did not look up from the bed. The lead litigator, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a diamond lapel pin, typed a rapid sequence. The mechanical clack of her keyboard echoed off the pale green cinder block walls like a firing squad loading their rifles. Geneva confirms. The litigator stared at her glowing screen. The shell company holding Sterling Pharmaceuticals' primary accounts is frozen. We have locked $34 billion in liquid capital. The offshore Cayman trusts are rerouted to the Vance holding shell. Wall Street algorithms are already panicking. The estate? A federal marshal stepped forward. He unrolled a thick, watermarked document. The gold seal of the United States District Court caught the amber bedside light. Property seizure warrant is active. The marshal tapped the heavy paper. The Buckhead estate reverted to Vance Biotech ownership 3 minutes ago. The central security matrix is overridden. Julian Sterling's biometric access is wiped from the master server. He cannot open his own front door. Cancel his private credit lines. Another litigator spoke into a sleek silver headset. Real-time destruction of a $20 billion king happening over a hospital bed. American Express Centurion card voided. All domestic checking accounts show a 0 balance. The title to his corporate fleet is transferred. The private jet in Hartsfield-Jackson is grounded by federal aviation authorities. A loud commotion erupted down the linoleum corridor. "Arr! Out of my way. I endow this entire wing." Julian's voice boomed over the steady hum of the medical machinery. He marched toward room 412. He expected to find a weeping, broken woman surrendering her child to the state. He expected the final, pathetic whimper of a defeated parasite. He adjusted his custom charcoal designer suit jacket. He prepared to sign the custody transfer papers and erase Amara from history. He stepped into the doorway. He froze. Chloe Davenport slammed into his back. The mistress wore her tailored scarlet blazer. Her heavy gold Cartier bangles clattered together in a chaotic jingle. She rubbed her shoulder, glaring past Julian into the room. "What is the delay, Julian?" Chloe pushed her way to his side. "Get the infant and let us leave this depressing place." Marcus Reed stopped 3 paces behind them both. The head of private security analyzed the threat. He noted the U.S. Marshals blocking the exits. He noted the elite litigators typing on the sterile counters. He noted the 4 Maybachs visible through the rain-battered window. The tiny green light on his security body camera pulsed in a steady, rhythmic blink. He kept his hands away from his tactical belt. He remained silent. He recorded the trap closing around his employer. Julian stared at the dozen strangers occupying the space. He let out a short, hollow laugh. "What is this?" Julian pointed a manicured finger at the litigators. "A charity legal clinic? Amara, you cannot afford these people. Your accounts are frozen. You cannot buy a cup of coffee in this city." He puffed out his broad shoulders. He projected the unchecked arrogance of a man who believed he held the entire world by the throat. "I have a court order." Julian snapped his fingers at Chloe. Chloe smirked. She tapped the stolen 10-carat emerald-cut diamond resting on her thumb. She pulled a folded legal document from her red blazer. "State custody." Chloe tapped the stolen ring against the paper. "The child leaves with us. You leave in handcuffs if you resist. I suggest you tell your little pro bono defense team to pack up their laptops." Vance stood with his back to the door. He watched the rain strike the glass. He turned around. His movements were slow, then deliberate, then heavy. He planted the platinum tip of his cane against the linoleum. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Julian's arrogant smile faltered. His eyes locked onto the older man's face. His brain struggled to process the visual data. He remembered a weeping, unkempt old man in a basement surrounded by chalkboards and empty coffee cups. He remembered a senile biochemist too paralyzed by grief to fight for his own miracle cure. The titan standing before him radiated absolute, undeniable power. "Arthur?" A microscopic tremor shook Julian's vocal cords. "What are you doing here?" Julian looked from Vance to Amara. He looked at the baby resting against her chest. He looked back at Vance. The math refused to align in his mind. "You crawled out of your hole to visit a charity case?" Julian tried to force a laugh. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "You should thank me, Arthur. I took your messy little scribbles and built a $20 billion empire. I made you relevant." Vance did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He closed the distance between them. He took 3 long strides. He stopped inches from Julian's chest. The scent of expensive cedarwood radiating from the younger man met the cold, ozone sharpness of the storm clinging to Vance's wool suit. "My daughter never needed your money." The words dropped like anvils onto the polished floor. Julian stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face. His dark espresso skin took on a sickly gray pallor. "She was testing your character." Vance tilted his head. His dark eyes burned with a terrifying ancient wrath. "You failed." Chloe dropped her arm. The legal document slipped from her manicured fingers. It fluttered to the floor. It landed in a puddle of rainwater tracked in by the federal marshals. She stared at Amara. The pieces snapped together in her mind. "Amara Hayes! Amara Vance!" The quiet, unassuming woman she had spent months plotting to destroy was the sole heir to the very empire she was trying to steal. Julian stumbled backward. His heel caught the edge of a plastic waste bin. He caught his balance against the pale green wall. "Daughter?" Julian grabbed his own collar. "Amara Hayes. Her name is Hayes." "Her mother's maiden name." Vance adjusted his silver French cuffs. She wanted to know the man who stole her father's legacy. She thought she could find a sliver of decency inside you. Vance planted his cane again. "You built your glass castle on my blueprints, Julian, but I've come to repossess the foundation." Julian shook his head. The manicured reality he had constructed was unraveling thread by thread. He looked at the litigators typing away his fortune. "No," Julian pointed a trembling finger at Amara. "I hold the patents. I hold the corporate registry. Chloe drafted the paperwork." Vance glanced at Chloe. The mistress shrank back against the doorframe. The vibrant red of her blazer suddenly looked like a target. Her hand instinctively hovered over her flat stomach, a protective gesture for a pregnancy that did not exist. Marcus Reed watched her hand cover her belly. The security chief cataloged the movement. He knew the truth about her medical files. He watched the architect of his betrayal begin to drown. "Your mistress drafted fraudulent filings." Vance signaled the lead litigator. She hid discrepancies in the clinical trial dates. She backdated the LLC formations. A federal crime punishable by 20 years in a maximum security facility. The raw notes you hold are worthless. The litigator handed Vance an iPad. He held the glowing screen up to Julian's face. Julian's eyes darted across the text. "Federal injunction, asset freeze, warrants for immediate property seizure. Your private banking accounts are locked." Vance recited the destruction with surgical calm. "Your stock portfolio is seized. The Novacor molecule is flagged by the FDA as stolen intellectual property. Sterling Pharmaceuticals is suspended from the New York Stock Exchange." Julian choked on his next breath. He grabbed his chest. The custom charcoal designer suit felt like a straitjacket. He looked at the federal marshals. He looked at the spinning red and blue lights reflecting through the rain-battered window. He had marched into the hospital expecting to claim his final victory. He had walked into his own execution. "You cannot do this." Julian dragged oxygen into his lungs. "I already did." Amara shifted on the rigid recovery bed. Arthur Jr. let out a fierce, demanding wail. The sound cut through the tense air, a raw testament to his survival. The baby kicked against her chest, strong and defiant. Amara placed her hand flat against his tiny back. She looked directly at Julian. She did not break eye contact. Her silence had been a shield in the storm. Now it was a gravestone. "You threw my grandson onto the ice." Vance lowered his voice to a lethal, vibrating baritone. "You locked the gate." Julian pressed his back flat against the cinderblock wall. The arrogance vanished. The grand monologues about kings and parasites evaporated. He was a thief caught inside the vault. Marcus Reed shifted his stance in the doorway. He angled his broad chest. He ensured the tiny green light of his camera captured every bead of cold sweat forming on Julian's forehead. He recorded the exact moment the billionaire CEO realized he was penniless. Chloe backed away. She edged out into the hallway. She looked down at the stolen 10-carat diamond on her thumb. It no longer looked like a crown jewel. It looked like a tracker. Her own greed had marched her directly into a federal indictment. Vance turned his back on the villain. He dismissed him. He returned to Amara's side. He reached down and smoothed the coarse hospital blanket over his grandson. Julian remained pinned against the wall. He dragged oxygen into his burning lungs. He stared at the woman he had discarded, the child he had abandoned, and the titan he had tried to rob. His empire was gone. The floor gave way. He could not move. The Sterling Estate grand ballroom lay exactly as they had left it, frozen in the violent aftermath of a shattered dynasty. Storm had finally passed, bleeding out into the morning, leaving behind a cold, brutal, gray dawn that pressed heavy and unforgiving against the 30-foot conservatory windows. The glass, usually transparent, was fogged with condensation from the violent drop in barometric pressure. Dawn light filtered through the thick panes, casting long, bruised violet shadows across the imported white marble floor. Above, the three-tiered Czechoslovakian crystal chandelier hung perfectly still, its thousands of multifaceted prisms illuminating a pristine graveyard of interrupted celebration. The massive, intricately carved ice sculpture of the Novacore molecule, the foundation of Julian's pharmaceutical empire, sat half-melted on its ornate silver pedestal. Freezing water dripped from the remaining jagged, asymmetrical edges of the chemical bonds, pooling steadily onto the custom, gold-threaded silk table runners. The water saturated the heavy fabric, turning it dark, before spilling over the edge in a rhythmic, agonizingly slow cadence onto the polished stone floor beneath. The air inside the cavernous, vaulted space smelled of stale, flat champagne, the greasy, lingering scent of roasted duck with plum glaze, and the sharp, metallic ozone of the departing electrical storm. Beneath it all lay the faint, coppery scent of sweat and fear. 400 of Atlanta's elite stood corralled against the pale, silk-lined walls. The grand ballroom perfectly resembled a hostage situation wrapped in high-end couture and bespoke tailoring. The ruthless hedge fund managers who had whispered conspiratorially behind their crystal champagne flutes only hours ago now stared straight ahead, their jaws tight, their breathing shallow. The federal regulators, men and women accustomed to holding the power in any room, kept their hands shoved deep inside their tailored wool pockets, their eyes carefully avoiding the center of the floor. Sweaty, exhausted photographers held heavy professional cameras tight against their chests. No one dared trigger a flash. No one dared adjust a lens. Heavily armed U.S. Marshals in thick black tactical gear guarded the heavy mahogany double doors, their heavy combat boots planted wide and resolute on the slick, damp stone, their hands resting over the grips of their holstered sidearms. Amara Vance sat in the exact center of the room. She occupied a high-backed, oxblood mahogany chair imported directly from Julian's private study, a throne reclaimed. A thick, heated, charcoal gray cashmere blanket was draped heavily over her small shoulders, shielding the tattered remains of her ruined cream silk gown. The delicate fabric of her dress was still stained with dried mud and the rust-colored blooms of her own blood. She cradled Arthur Jr. tightly against her chest. The premature newborn weighed barely 3 pounds. He wore a tiny, woven white cotton cap provided by the neonatal intensive care unit. His delicate, bruised plum skin rose and fell in a steady, determined, fighting rhythm against the hollow of her collarbone. The faint, sweet scent of warm milk and the sharp, clinical sting of hospital iodine clung to his impossibly fragile frame, overpowering the scent of the stale ballroom. Amara rested her chin gently against his perfectly warm head, anchoring her entire existence to the quiet, rhythmic wheeze of his breathing. Dr. Arthur Vance stood solidly at her right shoulder. The titan of the medical world rested both of his massive, weathered hands on the gleaming platinum head of his polished ebony cane. He did not blink. He stood like an ancient monument, casting a protective, impenetrable shadow over his daughter and his grandson. Julian Sterling stood near the base of the sweeping grand staircase. His bespoke charcoal designer suit, once a flawless armor of corporate invincibility, hung rumpled and defeated over his broad shoulders. The crisp, heavily starched white French cuffs carried dark, chaotic smears of spilled hospital coffee and dried rainwater. His heavy, platinum Rolex dug into his wrist like a polished handcuff, the second hand ticking forward with deafening precision. He looked frantically at the pale faces of his cornerstone investors, searching for an ally, searching for a lifeline. He saw only locked, grinding jaws, averted eyes, and rigid postures. Chloe Davenport stood exactly 3 feet to his left. The chief legal officer still wore the flawless, blood-red silk slip dress she had selected for her victory lap. The massive, priceless diamond and ruby collar pulled incredibly heavy against her collarbones, the cold gems feeling more like a garrote than a triumph. She crossed her bare arms tightly over her stomach, her 6 stacked gold Cartier bangles clattering together in the tense, suffocating quiet of the room. Her carefully manicured nails dug half-moon crescents into her own skin. Helena stepped purposefully into the empty, echoing space between the base of the grand stairs and Amara's chair. The veteran nurse's dark green hospital scrub stood out stark and out of place against the sterile white marble floor and the sea of black tie evening wear. She casually clasped her hands in front of her waist, her posture radiating an unbreakable clinical authority. Her polished silver Vance Biotech nursing pin caught a stray beam of the gray morning light, glinting sharply. She arrived at the emergency bay barefoot. Helena did not use a microphone. She did not need one. Her steady, unwavering voice carried perfectly to the farthest, darkest corners of the cavernous room, bouncing off the soaring ceilings. The soft tissue on the soles of her feet was completely shredded. Her knees were deeply lacerated by the jagged driveway gravel she was forced to crawl across. Her core body temperature registered at exactly 94.2 degrees upon intake. The severe blunt force trauma to her abdomen, combined with the extreme, sudden environmental shock of the freezing rain, triggered an immediate, catastrophic placental abruption. He was deprived of oxygen. The child was born drowning in his own mother's blood. Amara slowly, tenderly ran the pad of her index finger down Arthur Jr.'s fragile, delicate spine, feeling the tiny vertebrae through the thin cotton. The tiny boy let out a soft, high-pitched, vibrating breath that sounded like a distressed sparrow. He shifted his minuscule weight, settling deeper into the protective cashmere warmth of his mother's chest. The ballroom absorbed the devastating truth. Dr. Elise Arrington walked slowly forward from the edge of the crowd. The chief of obstetrics kept her bloodshot eyes fixed firmly on the intricate veining of the marble floor. Her expensive Prada loafers sidestepped a spreading puddle of melted, champagne-scented ice. She reached into the deep, stiff pocket of her pristine white lab coat. Her hands shook violently. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The stiff paper rattled audibly in the dead quiet of the room. Julian Sterling contacted me directly. He offered an immediate, untraceable $50 million anonymous hospital endowment routed through his offshore shell corporations. Elise opened her trembling fingers. She dropped the heavy envelope onto the floor. The thick paper slapped wetly against the damp stone, sliding on a thin film of water before coming to a sudden halt, mere inches from the toe of Julian's scuffed leather Oxfords. He mandated explicitly and repeatedly that I deny Amara Vance any life-saving medical care. He ordered me to prioritize the complete extraction of the infant, and upon delivery, to immediately surrender the premature newborn directly to his armed corporate security team waiting in the restricted surgical wing. He instructed me to let her bleed out on the table. Elise's voice cracked, a jagged edge of pure self-loathing bleeding into her words. And God forgive me, I accepted the bribe. Elise finally lifted her head. The muscles in her neck strained as she forced herself to look at the tiny breathing bundle safely wrapped in Amara's protective arms. Hot, thick tears spilled over her dark eyelashes, cutting perfectly clean, shiny tracks through her ruined, smudged foundation and mascara. I abandoned my sacred oath. I sold my own sister to a monster for a new hospital wing. I fully surrender my medical license, my practice, and my freedom. Elise stepped backward, retreating into the dense crowd, instantly swallowed by the heavy, judgmental silence of the room. The reckoning was far from over. Marcus Reed walked deliberately to the master audiovisual center console built into the wall. The head of private security wore his impeccably fitted black tactical uniform, the dark fabric absorbing the faint light. He did not spare a single glance in Julian's direction. His face was a mask of carved granite. He unclipped the heavy black security body camera from the reinforced webbing of his chest rig. With slow, methodical precision, he pulled back the rubber seal and plugged the encrypted hard drive cord directly into the ballroom's central matrix. Above them, the massive 30-foot high-definition projection screens, hidden within the vaulted ceiling, hissed and descended on motorized tracks. They flickered to brilliant, blinding life, casting a harsh, cold blue glow over the pale, shocked faces of the elite crowd. The entire ballroom watched the execution play out in brutal, unedited, high-definition clarity. They saw the towering, terrifying figure of Julian Sterling grab Amara's delicate jaw, the camera capturing the exact moment his manicured thumb dug mercilessly deep into her pale cheekbone. They saw the violent, sickening jerk of her neck. They saw Chloe Davenport standing in the background, her victorious, malicious sneer perfectly painted across her dark crimson lips as she watched the abuse. They heard the brutal, deafening howl of the April storm, violently rushing through the open mahogany double doors, a roaring wall of wind and freezing rain. They heard Julian's voice, distorted but terrifyingly clear over the wind, issue the brutal command to his guards to throw his own pregnant, bleeding wife out into the black ice. They heard the heavy, metallic finality of the solid brass deadbolt slamming shut. They watched, helpless, as the small, frail woman slipped on the wet, freezing stone of the portico and fell backward, the horrifying wet crack of her body hitting the jagged, unyielding asphalt echoing through the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The collective, horrified inhale of 400 people forcefully sucked the oxygen from the room. Julian opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically, his chest heaving under his ruined shirt. He desperately searched for a lie, for a spin, for a legal loophole. No sound emerged from his throat. The final blow came from within. Elias Thorne stepped smoothly out of the shadows cast by the grand staircase. The lead corporate litigator held a thick, perfectly aligned stack of pristine white printer paper. He had spent 4 grueling years viciously burying Julian Sterling's corporate enemies, bankrupting whistleblowers, and shielding the billionaire from every federal consequence. Now, standing sharply flanked by 2 massive federal marshals, he read the execution order required to salvage his own freedom and his own legal license. Elias casually flipped past the first few pages to a section heavily highlighted in blinding yellow ink. He cleared his dry throat, the sound incredibly loud in the suffocating quiet. Audio transcript, recorded via hidden office surveillance, timestamp exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes prior to the medical incident. "Read it, Elias." Vance tapped the heavy platinum tip of his cane against the marble floor. The sharp, violent crack echoed through the massive room like a close-range gunshot, making 3 hedge fund managers physically flinch. Elias nervously adjusted the bridge of his silver-rimmed glasses, pushing them up his sweating nose. He looked down at the highlighted text. Elias read verbatim. "She was a zero-balance asset, just a cheap incubator I rented until I finished building my throne." Amar asked, "Tell me, who has nothing now?" A crushing, physical silence pressed into the guest's lungs. Julian swallowed incredibly hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. The thick blue vein running along his left temple throbbed, visibly expanding, thick and frantic beneath his dark, sweating skin. Elias reached over and tapped a single key on the center console keyboard. The massive projection screens flickered and instantly shifted. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner read exactly 3 weeks ago. The location stamp brightly identified an ultra-exclusive private Buckhead fertility clinic. On the screen, Chloe Davenport sat nervously on a crinkled white paper examination table. She wore a heavy, expensive crimson trench coat over her designer clothes. She reached into her leather handbag and aggressively handed a thick, banded stack of $100 bills to a woman wearing a generic, oversized gray hoodie pulled low over her face. The woman quickly pocketed the cash and handed Chloe a heavy, sealed white envelope bearing the clinic's embossed gold logo. One more deception was laid bare. A man in a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped forward from the dense crowd of investors. "Dr. Evans." "Miss Davenport bypassed our standard protocols," the clinic director stated, his voice devoid of emotion as he adjusted his blue silk tie. "She purchased positive pregnancy blood results directly from one of my desperate 3rd trimester surrogates. She paid in untraceable cash, demanding full medical anonymity and requesting specific, falsified sonograms to match the timeline she required." Dr. Evans folded his hands together. "I conducted a full internal audit the moment the marshals arrived. I can confirm unequivocally that Miss Chloe Davenport has never been pregnant." Chloe's flawless, aristocratic face turned the exact, horrifying color of wet ash, all the blood drained from her cheeks in a singular, terrifying rush. The heavy gold Cartier bangles crashed together in a loud, chaotic, frantic jingle. As her hands began to shake violently against her hips, she opened her mouth to scream a denial, but her throat simply closed. Marcus Reed slowly turned his head to look directly at Chloe. His dark, usually stoic eyes hollowed out into a dead, terrifying, unblinking stare. The heavy, corded, thick muscles in his jaw locked so tight that the bone visibly threatened to snap right under the skin. The man who had protected her, who had believed her lies about the child she carried, looked at her as if she were a corpse. Chloe said nothing. Her terrified, suffocating silence was her undeniable confession. Judge Harrison Davenport pushed his way violently to the front of the crowd, shoving past a horrified federal regulator. The older, incredibly powerful man wore a heavy, impeccably tailored black wool overcoat. His lined, weathered face perfectly mirrored the aristocratic severity of the terrified woman shrinking back against the solid mahogany grand staircase. He did not yell. He did not point his finger. He did not show a single ounce of sorrow. "You are a disgrace to everything our family has built. You are no longer a Davenport. You will not contact us. You will not return to the estate." He turned his back on his only daughter, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply on the marble, and walked straight out the heavily guarded, open double doors without looking back. Chloe stumbled backward, her vision tunneling. Her sharp red stiletto caught the thick, bunched edge of the damp silk table runner pooling on the floor. She lost her balance and fell incredibly hard onto her bare knees. The violent physical impact cracked sickeningly against the unforgiving stone. As her hands hit the wet floor to brace herself, the massive, stolen 10-carat emerald-cut diamond engagement ring slipped cleanly past her damp knuckle. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, high-pitched tink. It rolled rapidly across the wide expanse of the room, spinning faster and faster, before coming to a dead, sudden stop right against the gleaming platinum tip of Vance's heavy cane. The heavy leather folio still sat abandoned near the marble pillar. Julian tripped over its brass clasp. He stepped frantically forward, his shoes splashing into the puddle of melted ice water. He raised both of his shaking hands into the air, palms out, begging for order. He desperately tried to summon the booming, theatrical, commanding baritone that had successfully dominated federal regulators, cowed Wall Street titans, and mesmerized the pharmaceutical industry for half a decade. "Listen to me, all of you, just listen to me." Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. I synthesized the Novacore molecule with my own hands. I spent thousands of hours in the lab. I filed every single one of the patents. I built the massive manufacturing factories from absolute dirt. You all profited off my sweat. You all took my money. A senior hedge fund manager standing in the front row deliberately, slowly turned his back to the billionaire, fixing his cold, uninterested gaze completely on the damp silk wallpaper. The current mayor of Atlanta looked down at his glowing phone screen, casually swiping away a text notification. The exhausted press photographers fully lowered their heavy lenses, letting the expensive cameras hang useless on their thick nylon neck straps. Julian raised his voice even higher. A desperate, wet, cracking plea ripped from his throat, echoing pathetically up into the cavernous, painted ceiling, bouncing uselessly off the hanging crystal chandelier. I am the sole architect of this empire. You are nothing without me. I built this." A young catering waiter wearing a crisp white vest quietly bent down to collect 3 empty, smeared champagne flutes from a small glass side table. The crystal glasses clinked loudly and casually over the frantic, screaming words of the dying billionaire. 2 senior board members standing near the windows began a very quiet, incredibly casual conversation about the terrible morning traffic piling up on Peachtree Road. They did not boo him. They did not shout him down. They did not call him a monster. They simply collectively stopped acknowledging his existence as a human being. Amara sat perfectly still, watching the terrifying billionaire CEO dissolve into thin air. He waved his arms wildly. He shouted his impressive, world-changing accomplishments to a silent room of Livingstone statues. He was already a ghost, screaming and haunting a massive, empty house he no longer owned. She turned her attention away from the man evaporating in front of her. She gently pressed her warm, steady hand against Arthur Jr.'s tiny, rising back, feeling the miraculous heat of his beating heart. She let the heavy, charcoal cashmere blanket fall away, letting it pool softly onto the floor over the ruined, blood-stained silk of her gown. She planted her bare, bandaged feet firmly onto the cold, unforgiving marble. Using the solid, heavy armrest of the mahogany chair, she pushed through the screaming agony radiating from her bruised ribs and her torn muscles. She stood up on her own. The cold marble floor sent a sharp, unforgiving chill up Amara's spine. She stood tall in the exact center of the ruined grand ballroom. She shifted her weight to balance on her uninjured left heel. Her right knee throbbed. Jagged, weeping cuts burned beneath the thick white hospital gauze wrapped around her leg. She did not waver. She cupped her right hand over Arthur Jr.'s fragile head. The premature newborn weighed barely 3 pounds. His tiny, bird-like ribs vibrated against her bare collarbone. A rapid, frantic fluttering pulsed beneath his bruised plum skin. He felt like a moth trapped inside a delicate paper lantern. He smelled of warm formula, sterile hospital cotton, and raw, defiant survival. The massive ballroom held 400 silent guests, Wall Street titans, federal regulators, men who bought local politicians, women who controlled global medical supply chains. They all stared at their own expensive shoes. The lead corporate litigator snapped her reinforced aluminum briefcase shut. The metallic click echoed like a heavy guillotine blade dropping across the room. Elias Thorne adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. His hands shook. He slid a thick stack of federal injunctions into a brown leather folio. He zipped the heavy brass teeth closed. He refused to look at the billionaire who had paid his exorbitant retainer for 4 years. Julian Sterling stood near the base of the sweeping grand staircase. His custom charcoal designer suit hung rumpled and defeated over his broad shoulders. Spilled water darkened the sharp lapels. The crisp white French cuffs clung to his wrists, soaked through with melted ice and gray dirt. Julian stepped forward. His polished leather Oxford splashed into a spreading puddle of water. Nobody looked up. Nobody moved to offer a lifeline. The hedge fund managers pulled heavy smartphones from their tailored pockets. Thumbs swiped in frantic strokes across glowing glass screens. The New York Stock Exchange pre-market ticker flashed. Sterling Pharmaceuticals halted. A bright red banner crawled across Bloomberg terminals worldwide. Hostile takeover confirmed. Vance Biotech absorbed all intellectual property. Julian's staggering net worth evaporated in the span of 3 silent heartbeats. A heavy, gloved hand grabbed Chloe Davenport's bare shoulder. The chief legal officer knelt on the wet marble. She scrambled backward like a cornered animal. Her bare knees slipped on the damp, gold-threaded silk table runner. The 10-carat emerald-cut diamond ring sat abandoned on the floor. It rested dull and useless against the gleaming platinum tip of Vance's ebony cane. 2 towering U.S. Marshals hoisted Chloe to her feet. She thrashed. The blood-red silk slip dress twisted tight around her thighs, riding up to expose her pale skin. 6 stacked gold Cartier bangles slammed together. They created a chaotic, metallic shriek that sliced through the dead quiet of the room. The taller marshal grabbed her right arm. He pulled it hard behind her back. Cold federal steel snapped shut over her delicate wrist. The ratcheting metal pinched her skin. The cuffs trapped the heavy, expensive gold bracelets against the cheap, unforgiving iron. "Get your hands off me," Chloe sneered. Her dark red lipstick smeared across her front teeth, ruining the manicured illusion of her superiority. The marshals ignored her command. They marched her toward the massive conservatory exit. Outside the 30-foot glass windows, the violent April storm had broken. The heavy gray clouds fractured. Pale, harsh morning sunlight pierced the gloom. It illuminated a massive sea of camera lenses. 4 dozen local reporters, financial correspondents, and ruthless paparazzi crushed against the metal police barricades. White news vans idled on the wet asphalt. Massive satellite dishes hummed on the metal roofs. The local police cruisers flashed red and blue emergency lights across the rain-slicked driveway. The heavy mahogany doors swung outward. The freezing morning air rushed inside. It carried the deafening roar of the press. Camera flashes erupted into a blinding, strobing wall of white light. The reporters screamed her name. They shouted aggressive questions about the forged clinical trials. They yelled about the fake pregnancy she had purchased. They demanded statements on the federal wire fraud indictments looming over her head. Chloe squinted against the brutal glare. She lowered her chin to her chest. The heavy diamond and ruby collar dug into her neck. The priceless gems felt like a suffocating chain of stolen wealth dragging her down. She stumbled on the brass threshold. Her sharp red stiletto caught the metal door track. The thin heel snapped clean off. She lurched sideways, her bare shoulders slamming into the rough stone doorframe. The marshal yanked her upright by the heavy steel chain connecting her wrists. She limped barefoot into the blinding light. A black federal SUV waited with an open side door. The agent shoved her into the leather-back seat. The heavy door slammed shut. The dark-tinted glass swallowed the vibrant red dress. The massive vehicle accelerated down the long, winding driveway. It vanished past the towering iron gates she had commanded Marcus to lock just hours ago. Julian watched the red taillights fade into the morning mist. He dragged cold oxygen into his burning lungs. His chest, he heaved beneath his ruined shirt. The thick vein along his temple throbbed a frantic, irregular rhythm against his skin. He turned back to face the ballroom. The 400 elite guests began to move. They did not speak to him. They did not offer hollow sympathies or extended hands. They flowed around his standing figure like a river parting around a dead, rotting tree. The mayor of Atlanta walked out the side exit without a backward glance. The pharmaceutical board members filed toward the coat check. They abandoned the sinking ship to save their own reputations. Marcus Reed stepped away from the audiovisual console. The head of private security unclipped the body camera from his chest rig. He placed the small black device onto a silver catering tray. The tiny green light blinked one final time before going dark. Marcus unbuckled his Sterling-issued tactical belt. The heavy rig hit the floor with a dull thud. He pulled the corporate security patch from his shoulder Velcro. He dropped the fabric emblem into a puddle of spilled champagne. He walked past his former employer without uttering a single syllable. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped directly into Julian's path. Their heavy combat boots crushed the fallen, bruised white orchids scattered across the marble floor. Julian dropped to his knees, the crushing realization hitting him that he had destroyed his family for Chloe's fabricated lie. He whispered, "I built this empire. I am the architect. Please." The crowd ignored him, leaving him in silence. Amara looked down at the broken man on his knees. She searched his dark, hollow eyes. She looked for the charismatic visionary she had met at a charity gala 4 years ago. She looked for the charming man who had filled a massive botanical garden with thousands of white orchids just to make her smile. She looked for the husband she had tried to love. She found nothing, just a terrified, empty shell drowning in his own manufactured ruin. No tears burned her eyes, no anger spiked her pulse. The fire had burned out hours ago, leaving only cold, impenetrable ash. "He will never know your name." Amara turned her back. She adjusted the heavy cashmere blanket over her child. She tucked the tiny, fragile hand back into the warm cocoon against her skin to protect him from the draft. She walked toward the towering mahogany doors. Vance walked right beside her. The heavily armed marshals flanked their path. The remaining elite guests pressed their backs flat against the silk wallpaper to grant her the widest possible berth. Julian lunged forward. He tried to scream. He tried to follow her out the door. A heavy combat boot slammed onto the back of his calf. The lead marshal grabbed the short steel chain connecting the cuffs. The agent jerked his arms upward. The sharp, unyielding edge of the metal bit deep into his wrist bone, forcing him down, pinning him to the wet marble floor. Julian gritted his teeth. He pressed his cheek against the freezing stone. He watched her walk away. He watched the ruined cream silk dress sweep across the floor. He watched the broad, protective shoulders of Vance guiding her path out of the nightmare. She stepped into the unbroken light of a morning that belonged only to her. The heavy brass deadbolt slid into the strike plate with a sharp, metallic crack.